I found the rose in the devil's garden.
Welcome back to The Place of Places, a chapter-by-chapter analysis of William Saroyan's 1972 memoir, Places Where I've Done Time. Today, we consider Fresno, 1926. This is the beginning of his more conceptual chapters, which happen much more frequently in the last third of the book. It's not really a specific place like so many of the others, but it's rather a state of mind. Fresno in 1926 means many things to Saroyan, and here he contemplates them. He tells us that as early as 10 years old, he was ready to leave Fresno. In itself, it was a lively, if poor and stupid place, although there were some people who were not exactly poor in possessions, and some others who were not exactly backward in the dimension of cleverness. Otherwise, it was a place to avoid, and if that was not possible, to get away from as soon as possible. So far in this book, Fresno had pretty positive associations, from root beer and ice cream to friendships and bicycles. Of course, he struggled in school and eventually fought so much with his teachers, administrators, his uncle, and his mother that he just had to leave town altogether for a while when he was 17. This is a glimpse into the darker side of Fresno, and there is an accompanying history that very much validates the reader's suspicions that all was not great for Armenians in Fresno. Redlining was rampant in early days of Fresno and the rest of California. This was state-sponsored segregation, where only certain groups of people were approved for home loans in certain neighborhoods, with interest rates making it near impossible for many immigrants to own land. This kept immigrants and non-white people in separate neighborhoods than the wealthy so-called American residents. Armenians were part of this redlining in the early and mid-1900s in Fresno. Although eventually outlawed, the practice influenced neighborhoods for generations, which has resulted in West Fresno still being a neighborhood for immigrants and poorer people of color. In 1944, deed covenant for the Tony community of Fig Gardens included this restriction: that neither said premises nor any part thereof shall be used in any manner whatsoever or occupied by any Negro, Chinese, Japanese, Hindu, Armenian, Asiatic, or native of the Turkish Empire, or descendant of above-named persons, or anyone not of the white or Caucasian race, provided, however, that such a person may be employed by a resident upon said property as a servant for such resident. This was 20 years after Saroyan left, however. In the early 1900s, in Saroyan's orbit, he felt the discrimination most viscerally in his teachers. In Here Comes, There Goes You-Know-Who, he writes of an elementary school teacher who was frank with him. Quote, "And then, all of a sudden, she took pleasure in punishing me by making me stand in the corner. Now and then she kept me after school, too, for nothing really, and ordered me to work with her wiping the blackboards clean with a moist cloth, all the while keeping up a running commentary about her job and the town and the kids she was trying to teach. The kids of immigrants, Armenians mainly, but others too, a few Syrians, a few Assyrians, dark people with dark eyes you could never understand. They kept to themselves. You never knew if you were getting through. They were still in another world, even though they were born in Fresno. And why did I encourage them to stay that way instead of opening up and being teachable, and here instead of far away? Why did I set them a bad example by saying something in Armenian all of a sudden, and making everybody laugh, embarrassing her? Didn't I know it was rude to speak a foreign language in class? How should she know what I was saying? Was I making fun of her? If so, why? No, we just like to talk Armenian once in a while, that's all. But why? This is America now. The Americans don't like us, so we don't like them. So that's it. Which Americans don't like you? All of them." The conversation ends with young Willie telling his teacher, "But we're here too, now, and if you can't stand the only way we can be Americans too, we'll go right on being Armenians." School was one of Saroyan's chief complaints, and this is where he felt the hand of authority most painfully. At this time, teachers were being instructed to actively attempt to, quote, Americanize students, even being instructed to make house calls after school to better engage mothers and convince them of the necessity of speaking English at home and assimilating their children for the benefit of the country.
Oh, here comes Miss Madrigal.
Well, William,
Yes, ma'am.
isn't an Armenian boy taught to tip his cap to a lady?
I'll lay off the Armenians, will you, Miss Madness? Yes, ma'am.
It's a simple thing to do.
Yes, ma'am.
Then why don't you?
I don't know.
Oh, come now. Why? Why?
Honest, I don't know why, Miss Madrigal.
Tip your cap. Tip your cap! Armenians.
Poor old school teacher. Poor old hater. Not like Miss Balthus or Miss Waterman or Miss Schilling. No, not like the good teachers. Boy, I gotta get out of this town, that's all.
A 1918 state report entitled Fresno's Immigration Problem lays out an effort to Americanize and assimilate the immigrants in Fresno, chiefly to create unity during wartime. This was of great concern to the state and country. Interestingly, the report was comparatively positive about Armenians who had started living on the wrong side of the Southern Pacific tracks in the foreign quarter, but who by 1918 were already moving into the so-called American neighborhood. The report actually delves a little into the history of Armenian immigration in America, noting that, quote, years of oppression have made them aggressive and eager to seize every opportunity for advancement that the freedom of America has to offer, end quote. The report also applauds how many Armenian children were kept in school. Of course, Saroyan only made it through 8th grade before dropping out. The report continues that, quote, unfortunately, the Armenians exhibit certain antisocial traits which stand in the way of their being easily assimilated. They are so aggressive that their ambition sometimes carries them into questionable business practices, end quote. This last part might have made adult Saroyan chuckle, though in seriousness, the report painted such a wide stereotype of each immigrant group that it's hard to believe today. In his stories, Saroyan sometimes makes mention of the Volga Germans, or those Germans who lived on the edges of Russia for hundreds of years. In the 19th and 20th centuries, this group began migrating to various parts of the U.S., including Fresno, which suited their existing agricultural background. The report reserves its most harsh words for this group, accusing them of inbreeding and having a religion so strict as to make them bland outcasts, totally unable to fit into American society. Every immigrant group would have felt attacks in this report individually, but the state's lengthy negative opinion of the Volga Germans is one not often discussed in immigration literature. The first institutionalized discrimination on record against Armenians in Fresno, according to Bubulian, was when the Congregational Church ousted the Armenians in 1894. There was a brief time in the 1890s when a Miss Peabody, a missionary in Turkey, explained to locals in Fresno that Armenians were acceptable because they were Christians. But by the 1920s, the eugenics movement had taken the country, and most immigrants were looked on with scorn. Though second-generation Armenians saw much success in school and in business, until the 1950s they were barred from athletic and social organizations. And some of the poorer workers were excluded from farm work on non-Armenian farms. Overall, Armenian discrimination, specifically in the city of Fresno, occurred at many levels during the first half of the 20th century. As we noted in the analysis of the previous chapter, Fresno was too small time for Saroyan, whose imagination soared beyond the confines of the San Joaquin Valley. And though he remembered Fresno fondly in many ways, and wanted to return to those memories in his later years, he also understood that this insight could only be achieved from a distance. And probably anyone who has left their hometown knows exactly what he's talking about, and more so with each passing year. Throughout his career, he wrote of mixed feelings about Fresno. Sometimes it's a force for good, sometimes it's an unstoppable force bringing him back, and sometimes it's just negative. This often depended on the mood he was in when writing and what was going on in his life. He wrote of traveling as a sort of means towards enlightenment, but all roads eventually led back to Fresno. He writes in this chapter, "Going away has something to do with the search in general. For love, for the beautiful girl or woman who is to fulfill a man's truth and reality, for recognition, for acceptance, for work, for enthusiasm about the whole human experience. But most of all, going away is a search for one's best self. Going away, going to a new place, was beautiful. It pleased me in a way that very nearly nothing else could please me. It was a large act of pure love." In a June 1936 journal entry, he wrote of buying a car getting a license and driving around the country. I think this is an excellent plan. The next 4 months, the next 120 or 150 days, are the pleasantest throughout the country. I plan to get large maps of every state I pass through and get to know the state, the county, the place. It will all be very useful for future writings. That road trip never did materialize, but many others did. Though he traveled extensively in his life, mostly around Europe, he rarely wrote stories that took place in those locales. They were escapism and an inspiration for him, though, and though he may not have always believed it, he preached of the unity of mankind, so it was only right that he experience much of the world. Though he did write when on travels, he mostly gambled, but that in itself ended up influencing many of his stories. Vacation and inspiration were something he tried to keep synonymous in his mind. Some of this wanderlust was rooted in finding places that felt more welcoming than the ones he had grown up in. Both the orphanage in Oakland and the Mood in Fresno were not friendly towards Armenians. Both places were ethnically diverse, but that didn't stop the dominant Anglo-Saxon culture from shaming immigrants and anyone who didn't share that ancestry. Traveling the world opened him up to other dominant cultures, and also into the very countries from which the small-minded dominant culture of Fresno originated. Searching for a sense of place, of peace, was a lifelong journey for Saroyan. Though he tried to generate that sense of the wholeness of humanity in his writing, in reality he experienced divisiveness everywhere he went. He spoke of love, but he had many grievances, and on his deathbed had burned many bridges, even with his own children. But the legacy of an artist isn't necessarily the life they lived, but their body of work, and Saroyan's work spoke of love and unity, regardless of his own realities. Here he speaks of a swiftness he picked up in Fresno, on his bicycle or in any other number of ways, his mind always running and getting him into trouble at school. Perhaps it was the slowness of Fresno that allowed his swiftness to make itself known and to affect him so greatly. A faster town might have muted his awakening to the importance of swiftness and of rhythm to him. By the time he got to San Francisco, he was already measuring time and speed, and that city's rhythms were very different and apparent to him. Moving from city to city allowed him to notice the different rhythms of each city, and that may have driven his motivation to write, to get each place's rhythm out on paper, if he wasn't writing about where he was. He writes, "San Francisco was the place that followed Fresno, and it was a whole new world, with a far better location, climate, culture, and humanity. But I traveled from San Francisco too. I had to see everything, or as much of everything as I could possibly manage with the money I earned, or won at gambling, or acquired from the faithful cultivation of my skill as a writer, and from the hard work of writing." San Francisco is all over the daring young man on the flying trapeze and his other writings in the 1930s, including, of course, The Time of Your Life, which takes place in a saloon in San Francisco. It was his gateway to a wider world, and to the realities of how the Great Depression was affecting cities and immigrants in big cities, flattening most of them equally. And it was important for him to see that the cities, like Fresno, were rife with segregation and discrimination. By the time he published The Human Comedy in 1943, he had become aware of the general suffering of everyone everywhere. The story is often considered sweet and sentimental, but it's also mournful for a country losing its innocence with its young men off to war. He writes of the potential of the U.S. squandered and the ever-present yearning for one's home no matter what. Ara, their Armenian grocer in the book, tells his son, "In Russia alone, so near our own country, our own beautiful little nation, millions of people, millions of children every day go hungry. They're cold, pathetic, barefooted. They walk around, no place to sleep. They pray for a piece of dry bread, somewhere to lie down and rest, one night of peaceful sleep. And what about us? What do we do? Here in Ithaca, California, in this great country, America, what do? We wear good clothes. We put on good shoes every morning when we get up from sleep. We walk around with no one in the streets to come with guns or to burn our houses or to murder our children or brothers or sisters. We take rides out into the beautiful country in automobiles. We eat the best food. Every night when we go to bed, we sleep. And then, what are we? We are discontented. We are still discontented." He shouts to his son, "Be happy. I'm unhappy, but you must be happy." This is literature that has complicated depth, and though he wrote simply, His themes were challenging and broached sensitive topics of what it was to be American after the war, after all the atrocities in the name of freedom. My Name is Aram opens with the dedication. The writer returns these pleasant memories to the world at Fresno, California, from the year 1915 to the year 1925, from the time he was 7 years old and was beginning to inhabit the world as a specific person, to the time he was 17 years old and had forsaken his native valley for some of the rest of the world, and to the members of his immediate family in that world during those years, that is to say, to the ugly little city containing the large comic world, and to the proud and angry Saroyans containing all humanity. Everything he wrote had this duality, this yin and yang, knowing that the world was too complex to distill into good and bad, but rather contained the entire spectrum within. Fresno was this complicated concept to him. In his journals published as Days of Life and Death and Escape to the Moon, Saroyan wrote in November of 1967, "What does it mean to be in Fresno? Well, I'm here by choice, so at least there's that." Let's put this on the Saroyan map and move on.